Hallie, welcome to Waterstones.
Thank you.
We have spoken previously when The Five was being published, and I followed you around London as you gave me this amazing tour of the sort of locations and venues that are contained in that book. Your new book, I wish we could do a tour because it would take us across the Atlantic, and I'm afraid our budget doesn't quite extend to that this time. But it's a fantastic story. You have said that when you're writing these books, there is always a sort of feeling that there must be more to the story or the received story. And I wondered what it was about this particular story that first gave you that spark to think there must be more to this.
Well, the interesting thing is I came across this when I started writing The Five, because one of the people who connects both the stories, the Ripper story and the Crippen story, is Chief Inspector Walter Dew, who wrote his memoirs and titled it I Caught Crippen. Now, this was obviously the kind of apex of his career, was catching Crippen. And, he wrote all about, very sort of flowery, gripping autobiography full of all sorts of embellishment, as you can imagine. He was also on the Ripper case as a young police officer. But this was really amazing to me because it was such an incredible story. I mean, certainly the way he tells it, of this man and his mistress who dressed as father and son and got on a ship incognito and tried to get to Canada because he had murdered his wife. I thought, God, all right, I want to know more about this. And I certainly want to know more about it from a different perspective other than from the man who caught him, because one of the things I know about looking at these cases is that there are a variety of different people who are involved in these things, and every single one of them has a different perspective.
You are brilliant in your books at centering the victims and often, of course, the female characters, if you like. Before we do that, I think it's probably worth establishing a little bit about Crippen. He's one of those characters who I think I know a lot about, and then as I read your book I was like, I didn't know anything about this case at all, except a few scant details. But I thought in particular, if you could tell us a little bit about his medical training, and I suppose his particular interest in women's bodies, their reproductive systems. He was a doctor, but he was a homeopathic doctor. That was his training, wasn't it? So can you tell us a little bit about him?
Yes, so Crippen chose to study homeopathy, and bear in mind this was in the United States in the last quarter of the 19th century. He chose to study homeopathy when homeopathy was seen really as quite a popular alternative to conventional medicine, or orthodox medicine as they called it. And the reason for this is, if we think about really up until really that later period of the 19th century when antiseptic and anesthesia were brought in, having surgery and having things done to your body was absolutely horrific, and there was no guarantee that you would survive. It was called the age of heroic medicine, where, if you imagine somebody sawing off somebody's leg on a battlefield, or, bloodletting and all this, is really quite invasive. And the thing about homeopathy is it promised to do just the opposite of that. It was like cures like. You can take something which occurs in nature, which somehow mimics what you have, in a very, 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 very diluted form. And if you take enough of that, it will cure whatever it is inside of you. And that appealed to a lot of people because it wasn't invasive.
Yeah.
And it was actually thought of as being quite a progressive alternative to orthodox medicine. Of course, there was a lot of infighting within homeopathy. There was a lot of sneering from outside the tent. Orthodox medicine didn't like it at all, and so Crippen was all part of this. Now, the interesting thing about this is that, he did genuinely believe in homeopathy, that it worked and the principles of it. But his area of expertise initially was women's medicine, was gynecology and obstetrics. And he hid that extremely well when the murder was being investigated. At one point, Belle, his wife, who he married, his second wife, he had her ovaries removed, he had her sterilized. And we don't have any proof of this absolutely, but it seems very likely that he would have participated in the surgery at the Hahnemann Hospital in Philadelphia. But this was his area, was gynecology, and it looks as though peripherally, I mean, he was probably involved in abortion, again, this was hidden so well because abortion was highly illegal, both in the United States and in the UK at that time. So you had to hide that. But he had a very dodgy medical past.
That's the right word for it. It's very, as you say, he's sort of constantly moving from place to place throughout his life, which is another way in which he's able to control Cora, as she is when he first meets her. Who then becomes Belle. The very confusing thing about reading this book is that the women often have many names.
Yes.
They have many changes of name. But yes, he meets Cora when she's having an abortion, and then they have this relationship that begins, and then he starts to exert this sort of control over her. And the reason why it's worth mentioning all this is because you throw some extra light on his first marriage. As you said, Cora was his second wife. His first wife, Charlotte Belle, died when she was very young, and you cast some doubt on this idea that she will have died of a stroke. You think there might be more to it than that.
Yeah.
Which is fascinating, and of course you think about the whole tale that is going to be told. What is it that leads you to believe that there may be more to the death of his first wife than previously thought?
Well, I mean, it's just this situation under which it occurred was very, very peculiar. The Crippens, and I say that's Charlotte and Hawley Harvey, were really down on their luck at that time. And again, he moved around a lot, and we don't know why. I mean, I'm pretty sure it was debt, it was money. He owed a lot of people a lot of money, and he would just kind of skip town. Because in the United States, you could just get lost. You could go somewhere else and change your name, and nobody would ever be able to find you again. But he had a really good appointment in New York, and within a handful of months, he was gone, and they moved to Salt Lake City, which was really out in the middle of nowhere at that time in the 1890s. And he had to start from scratch all over again. Charlotte, he had actually gone to Ireland looking for family money, and there was no family money because Charlotte's family were really kind of financially compromised, which is how they ended up in the United States. And then he came back, and then she was basically dead several months after that. And the circumstances were very peculiar. And I mean, she was buried within 72 hours. This was in the middle of winter. It was January. It was Utah. The temperature was below freezing. And she was buried in a pauper's grave, which was so odd, an unmarked grave. And, it just all happened so fast. And he had, on her death certificate, it seemed to indicate she had died of a stroke. But then in the kind of professional obituaries in the trade magazines, in the trade periodicals that he wrote for, there was an announcement that said she had died of heart failure. So which one was it? And there was something very peculiar that then comes up. So Crippen's parents seemed to follow him around everywhere. And again, they were quite strange characters. And following Belle's murder, before any of the pathology was done on the remains, some reporters found Crippen's father, Myron, in this kind of, basically this bedsit in Los Angeles, and this is in 1910. And he said, well, I mean, if my son had wanted to kill his wife, I mean, he'd probably use a poison which left no trace, which he did, and then just had a friend sign the death certificate, which he did with Charlotte, and that's it, and Bob's your uncle. And this was before they had found the poison in Belle's remains, and Myron had been there when Charlotte died. So I think that's highly suspicious. Highly suspicious.
Let's talk about Belle. She is such an amazing character. She stands very proudly on the front of the book. Tell me a little bit about Belle as a woman? Because she, as I said, she goes through many stages in her life, from really being very vulnerable when she first meets Crippen to really establishing herself, and maybe how that ties into the idea of the new woman, which is this really important idea at this particular time in history.
I mean, I think Belle was just an extraordinary person. And also what's very interesting is, I mean, often what we, and I mean kind of society in general, likes to do is to call any woman who was kind of strong and outspoken a feminist, you know, and as a historian, I sort of shy away from just slapping labels on people, because people did things for various reasons, and we like to think that people are very modern and they're very much like us, and any historian's caveat is yes and no. So, you know, it is never that straightforward. But I think in the case of Belle, she was so modern in her sensibilities, in that she was an incredibly resilient person, and that amazed me. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary. She was born in a tenement in Brooklyn to a kind of, what she lived with. Her stepfather was Polish, was German, and her father had been kind of Polish-Russian. Her mother was from a German family, so they were part of this community within New York, within Williamsburg. You know, and they had no money. They were very poor, but she went to school, and she, you know, and the education that was offered in the United States at that time was probably better than what you could get in the UK if you had no money. You know, she learned to read and write quite well, and she learned music, and then she went out to become a servant when she was about 16, 17. And now we don't know exactly what happened. She worked for a man called C.C. Lincoln, who was, and the way I can describe it is a kind of pioneer in central heating at that time, and was also involved in property development. And whether or not it was consensual, Belle became pregnant by him, and he put her up in her own apartment or flat. Coincidentally, this sort of coincides with a period when he had his wife committed to an asylum and was in the process of appropriating all of her property. So something was going on there that was a bit strange. But anyway, she got pregnant. A doctor who had employed Crippen then came and performed an abortion. She met Crippen. It was a whirlwind romance, and they got married in Jersey City, which was like a sort of Gretna Green. And he then Crippen decides that he doesn't want any children, and so he has her ovaries removed. And she was devastated, absolutely devastated. She talked about having children, wanted children. She was talking about it until, you know, almost the day she died in letters, how much she missed this opportunity. But remarkably, she found a way, some sort of channel for her passions, and she decided, right, if I'm not going to have children, I'm going to be an opera singer, that's amazing. This is, you know, this is the, early, mid 1890s. And so she trained as an opera singer, and when Crippen was transferred to London as part of this company he worked for, she thought, well, there's no point in pursuing this in London. I'm going to go on the music hall stage and be a music hall performer and reinvent myself as a music hall performer. And she takes the name Belle Elmore. And she did that. And, you know, she wasn't particularly great, but also a lot of people weren't particularly great. The majority of music hall performers have sunk without a trace. Yeah. So this idea, which is often put about, that like, oh, she was terrible, it's rubbish. Because if you look at the reviews, nobody says she's terrible. Nobody. Actually, a lot of people said she had an encore, or she had this, or she had that. She was an average performer in an enormous sea of average performers, where there was only one Mary Lloyd. Yeah. You know, and she. So, you know, when things weren't going the way she wanted them to, she became part of the Music Hall Ladies Guild, which was a social organization and a charity. And she threw herself into that. She became the treasurer, and she made incredible friendships, and actually just found this place amongst music hall establishment. Like, all the big stars of the day knew her, and she was friends with them. So she found happiness. And that to me, in a way, regardless of what then happened to her, was the type of happy ending for her.
We will come back to the Ladies' Guild because they're a really important part of the actual sort of murder and the trial later on. But before we do that, let's talk quickly about Ethel, who is the third woman who enters Crippen's life. Again, a woman who is clearly strong, and Crippen seemed to be attracted to these women who were sort of strong and energetic and had, great personalities, but also slightly scared of them, and obviously was trying to find ways to control them, and he does something similar with Ethel. Tell us a little bit about her, and I suppose the received story of her as being this person who was unaware of what was going on, but you question that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's so much more to Ethel than meets the eye, and that is something, I think, of everybody in this book, it's Ethel who haunts me, because there's so many mysteries still surrounding her and how much she knew and how much she participated in this. And, Ethel played the kind of, wilting violet, and but she wasn't at all. I mean, she had enormous reserves of strength. But more to the point, she was Crippen's sort of wing woman. She and Crippen were in cahoots together with everything. He was a fraudster, and that's one thing we have to remember, is that he ran very, very elaborate frauds, medical frauds. He was involved in stock fraud as well. Everybody around him were criminals, people who spent time in prison, people who were violent. And, and he was one of them. And she was one of these people too. She participated in these frauds. This idea that somehow Ethel had no agency, that, he just led her by the nose here and there. I think it was pretty much 50-50. I think it became a very collaborative effort after a while. She exerted a lot of influence on him. That people have discounted, and largely because this idea, she's a poor, suffering, innocent girl, what could she possibly know, was what has always coloured the picture of Ethel. It's completely untrue. And even when she talks about her own experiences, she just completely negates this. She just said, well, I made the decision. No, I did this, and I wanted that. But this story was not one that, I think ideally, for legal reasons, and we may come on to that, why, they didn't want that out in the world.
There is this extraordinary, you talk about them being bound together, which is a really great sort of metaphor, if you like, and there is this extraordinary scene when Belle has gone missing, it seems at first, and then Crippen has said that she has died in America. Ethel and Crippen go to this benevolent fund dinner together,
Yes.
completely publicly. This is only a matter of days or weeks after the supposed death of his wife. And she's actually wearing a brooch of Belle's to this dinner, quite brazenly. And you point out that that is an extraordinary thing to do unless you have a very special, I suppose, bond together and a confidence that you can actually brazen it out.
Yeah, brazen it out. And that's what, that's what they were saying about her. It was a real brazen act. By the way, we are filming this at Waterstones Piccadilly, and the Criterion is about a 30-second walk from the door. So this is...
that's where it happened, of course,
that's where it happened. So it all, so much of the stuff happened in central London.
Yeah.
So, that's quite interesting. But, I mean, the fact that they did that was incredible. I think that I do wonder what the conversation was behind the scenes that led to that flagrant act of defiance. I mean, it was two fingers in the face of everybody. And, at that time, musical performers had very kind of bohemian lives. And the idea of having an affair was just not at all, interesting or unusual to these people at all. And illegitimate children, all of this, normal. But what was offensive was the fact that, this was the Friends, and she was, they went to this huge ball, and it was organised by the musical ladies, who were all Belle's good friends. And it was so flagrant. It was right in front of the Friends, and she's wearing Belle's jewellery. And it was just, that was the shocking part. You know, they would have all realised, oh my God, you know, that's his mistress. But saying to your, you know, your wife's friends, by the way, this is my mistress I'm taking with me into this party, and I don't care what you think of me, is amazing. And they knew exactly what they were doing when they did it. Exactly.
It does seem to add even more fuel to the fire of the Women's Guild. And they were an amazing group of women who had this dogged pursuit of the truth. They didn't believe the version of events that had been given to them by Crippen. And so, in fact, they're a really important part of the investigation and the trial. I won't go over the details of the bits that people will probably know about the amazing sort of flight to Canada and the first use of the Marconi wireless to sort of catch a suspect and all that kind of stuff.
So the only bit that anybody ever remembers, you know, is that, which is the tech, exactly. And it's the very, very, very male perspective.
Yeah.
And it's Inspector Dew's perspective. And it completely just eradicates the story, which is so full of twists and turns and strange things. You know, that's the one thing. And yes, it is significant. There's so much more to the story. So much more.
The amazing scenes that you describe in the trial itself are really important, again, from a woman's point of view, because you make the point that with the women who ended up testifying in court, so some of these guild members, for example, that was the only role that they could possibly have had in a courtroom, because they weren't allowed to be solicitors or barristers or judges or anything like that. And
or even sit on juries.
Right. And so it's actually an extraordinary moment to have all of those women's voices there. Tell me again a little bit more about why it's significant.
Well, it was just their effort has been really kind of so dismissed throughout all of this, because, you know, you have the voices of all of the men who were involved in catching Crippen and bringing him to justice. So Inspector Dew wrote his memoirs, Captain Kendall, who identified them on the ship, wrote his memoirs, all the barristers involved in the trial wrote their memoirs, you know, so everybody's showing themselves to be a hero in the face of this villain and making the world perfect. The reality was, if it wasn't for the Music Hall Ladies Guild petitioning the police, hiring a private detective, doing their own research, and just being generally relentless, this would have just flown under the radar. Nobody would have ever known that Belle had been murdered, and Crippen would never have been caught. And also, this was, you know, why obviously Crippen and Ethel were so angry at the end of all of this, because if it wasn't for those meddling ladies, you know, we would have got away with it. But the women really, really did everything they absolutely could. And not just in this country. I mean, there was a whole international dragnet that was created in New York as well, with Belle's sisters and the other members of the Ladies Guild who were stationed in New York at that time, because music hall was, you know, an international thing, and a lot of them went on tours in the United States. So they gathered together to try to catch him. You know, they were searching the ships as they came in, and then Mrs. Jeanette, who was the president of the Ladies Guild, went to Quebec when Crippen was finally caught to kind of identify him and identify Belle's belongings, which were on him. And then the women, a number of the women testified not only at the inquest, at the hearing, but at the Old Bailey as well. You know, at an enormous personal cost. You know, they actually write about how traumatic this was for all of them. And then they fight to the bitter end. They pay for Belle's headstone and her funeral. They pay for a solicitor to effectively get inheritance law in this country changed. And it was because of the Crippen case that if you murder your spouse, you cannot therefore inherit their property. And there was a loophole in the law that allowed that to happen.
That seems extraordinary in 2025.
Yeah. Well, even the judge at the time remarked about how incredible that was. He said, look, this is a massive oversight in our laws, that this is even permissible.
That drive that you've just described of those women, how much of that is driven, do you think, by that notion of the new woman at the time? So these women who were gaining strength and independence. And how much of it is far more personal, is actually a reflection of their love and admiration for Belle as a person who had been such an important part of their group?
I think there's a little bit of both in this. You know, this is why this is a kind of temperature taking of the time, if you like, where, you know, they were absolutely dedicated to their friend. But the Music Hall Ladies Guild in itself, the fact that they formed this was in response to really kind of all of the male influence and the similar male charity groups. The Water Rats, for example, was one of them, and all of the power that they had. And the women wanted to do something as well. And this was one example of many. You know, there were lots of women's professional groups, and women were entering public life in this way. You know, this was at the same time as suffrage, the whole idea of the new woman. I mean, I think actually Ethel embodies the new woman even more, and this is what I found so fascinating about all of this is, you know, the new woman was financially independent to a degree from her family. She didn't have to live under her father's roof. She could do a job, which Ethel did, and Ethel was part of what was called the white blouse revolution. She worked in an office. She learned how to be a secretary. This was totally new. She was lower middle class, and this idea that women could work before they got married was a new thing. And she lived independently. She had, you know, her own room with Mrs. Jackson, her landlady. She had sex outside of marriage, you know, and, you know, she was able to do these things. And, you know, I mean, they talk about the new woman wearing something called rational dress, you know, trousers and riding a bicycle. And that was shocking. Well, Ethel wore trousers too, because she dressed up as a boy in order to try to evade capture. And so, you know, in many senses, she ticks the boxes, all the boxes of a new woman. But all of these women were so bold in their own way, you know, and I think it's so fascinating because here, you know, literally just grabbing a random story with random women from the Edwardian era, and you find just how much agency they have, you know, just how active they are in life, in, you know, earning their own income and trying to find a voice for themselves. And it is really unique and it's really interesting.
There are a lot of ambiguities in the case. As you were talking earlier, sort of looking at the death of Charlotte Bell, there are questions that sort of make you raise your eyebrows, and it's really hard to say anything for sure with a lot of historical records, I'm sure. But the death of Bell is still questioned by many people. I did check actually, even on the Wikipedia page for this case, it still says this thing about the remains that were found possibly being a man's remains and not a woman's remains at all. How certain are you about, I suppose, the version of the story that you're putting out in this book? I know you can't be 100%, but how do you, I guess, get to a point where you're going to go, this is what makes sense to me? Well,
first of all, there is an appendix at the back of my book, which was written by Professor Turi King, who was involved in the Richard III, the identification of the Richard III's remains. And she has read the white paper that was presented by this group who, for a documentary called Executed in Error, which was done in 2007, basically said, oh no, you know, this DNA result is incorrect and it was actually a man. And Turi read the white paper and she said, there's so many problems with this. It is in no way conclusive. And the jury is still out. And so, I mean, that's quite helpful to have that opinion. You know, subsequently, a lot of people have questioned it. I think it really makes me quite angry, actually, because the reality is there was a very watertight case here for Crippen being the murderer. I mean, if you have studied the case, I mean, and most people who've written on the case say, there's just no doubt. I mean, he killed her. It took the jury about 20 minutes to actually come up with their verdict. You know, there was some pretty incontrovertible evidence there. And this idea, well, let's go pick over this trial. Let's try to prove Crippen was actually innocent because we believe he was innocent, is like this extension of this mythology that has grown up, which is so abhorrent, is so deeply embedded in misogyny, because the first person to really write anything about this trial was a man called Alexander Bell Filson Young. And Filson Young was an appalling misogynist. I mean, just, he had decided as early as 1910, and he wrote this in 1920, that Crippen and Ethel's love was pure. And so when it came time for him to write the introduction to the trial transcripts, he said, basically, their love was, a noble love. And basically, Belle was a horrible person. And it was a noble thing he did to kill her so they could be together. So he had to slay this monster. But there was absolutely no proof whatsoever that she was a horrible person at all. And it's all completely fabricated. And there's plenty of evidence to suggest that she wasn't the person that he made her out to be. And Filson Young never even knew her. So what happened is that this kind of snowballed throughout the 20th century. And then Crippen was like, what a poor man, he was so put upon, and people said terrible things about him. What a nice man, he couldn't have killed his wife, and what a horrible, shrewish, evil woman she was, who dominated him and was sexually unfaithful. There's absolutely no evidence of any of this. If ever a woman deserved to die, it was Belle Elmore.
Which is a pretty extraordinary conclusion to come to for anybody to sort of say that anybody deserves to be murdered is always bizarre. I have to say that one of the moments in the book that still sticks with me and is one of the best pieces of evidence in my mind is a psychological thing, which is this extraordinary relationship between Ethel and her landlady, which you describe in fantastic detail. And it's really clear from their interactions that something awful is going on with Ethel, behind the scenes, that's really affecting her. And of course, this is at the time at which Belle is being murdered and things going. And it's so clear to me reading that bit that she is involved and she knows what's going on, and it's making her ill.
Yes.
I wondered was that a question of sort of looking at other sources, so finding out more about the landlady's point of view, that kind of personal human interaction, which shows you really clearly what was actually kind of going on despite the evidence in the trial?
Yes, well, actually, Emily Jackson, her landlady, left numerous statements. She was questioned over and over again, and this happens today in trials as well. You're questioned over and over again, and so there are lots and lots of documents where she's giving her point of view and what she believed and what she saw. And you could tell she just wanted to give the truth of all of this, and I think she was absolutely horrified by what had happened. And I think their relationship is so fascinating, and it's one of the most authentic, one of the truest relationships, because Ethel also had a very close relationship with her sister, but Nina, her sister, was really guarded in what she said. And it just makes you wonder how much she knows, how much she knew, But Mrs. Jackson was pulling no punches. She just wanted to give everything she knew to the police. And there, if the police had chosen, if Walter Dew had chosen to pursue and to probe all of the evidence around Ethel's guilt, and there was a considerable amount of that, and they chose not to follow the leads, I think they would have made a pretty watertight case against her, at least as an accomplice to murder.
It's a fascinating note on which to end, because it really does leave it up to the reader to decide, what to do with the evidence that you present. But it's another fascinating read, Hallie, and I can only thank you for giving me some time today to talk to you about it in a bit more detail.
Well, thanks. It was great.